So you want to be a guest on a podcast, but what do you do? What do you do before, during, or after? Well, after being on hundreds of podcasts as a guest, I'm going to deliver for you my 8 pro tips. Let's get started. Hey messengers, welcome to the Market Your Message show. I'm your host, Jonathan Milligan, and author of the book, Your Message Matters. This show is for you if you're an aspiring writer, speaker, teacher, coach, and you're just trying to figure out, how do I build the audience online? That's what the show is all about. So we're going to jump in today and talk about 8 pro tips that I have for you if you want to be a guest on a podcast. By the way, being a podcast guest is one of the easiest, most effective ways to grow an audience. And here's why. For 30 minutes of your time, as long as you are ready and you show up and you're interviewed for 30 minutes, the host is going to do all the other work, right? They're going to do all the editing. They're going to publish it to their listeners, their community, and they're going to even promote you on their show. I don't know about you, but that's one of the most time-efficient ways that you can spread your message is by getting out on other podcasts. Now, in a recent podcast and video, I talked about one tool that I've been using called Podmatch. Go back, watch that episode because it is effective. In fact, when I recorded that session live, there was one of our listeners in our community who her name's Leanne. She signed up for Podmatch and she told me within a couple of days she had 2 booked podcast interviews. And she's just really getting started on growing her audience. So that works. But now that you have a slot to be a guest on a podcast, what do you do now? That's what we're going to talk about today. But before we jump in, let's talk about what you're going to discover on the episode. I'm going to talk about the 3 things you must do before the podcast interview. This is going to make your life easier when you're actually on the podcast. A secret tip to answering questions on the interview itself. The 2 things you should do after the podcast interview that most people don't ever do. And much, much more. By the way, if you want to know a step-by-step plan for how you could take your message and turn it into a platform, then there's a book that I want to let you know about. This is a book that I recently published called Your Message Matters: How to Rise Above the Noise and Get Paid for What You Know. It's 267 pages of the complete roadmap of how I've been able to leverage blogging, podcasting, live streaming, doing video, to turn that into a platform, build a list, and make a business out of it full time since 2011. If you're interested in the book, you can actually get a free copy for being one of our listeners. Just go to yourmessagemattersbook.com. Again, it's yourmessagemattersbook.com. And all we ask is that you pay for shipping, and we'll send you a free book to your doorstep in a couple of days. So go and check that out. All right, so let's get into these 8 pro tips. And I've kind of categorized these by kind of 3 things you want to do before, a few things during, and a couple things after the podcast interview. All right, so let's jump into these. Pro tip number 1 is to invest in the right equipment. Now, when I say the right equipment, what I'm not saying is you got to go spend thousands of dollars on equipment you do not understand. Okay? At the end of the day, you need a quality mic and some type of headset. Now, you can get let's start with the headset first. That's the kind of the easier one. Now, you can get the big headset that you kind of put on your head. There's nothing wrong with that. But here's what I've found. More and more interviews that I'm doing, they're also recording a video. So here's what typically happens. I would say 75% of the time. Not everybody does this, but most podcast hosts are using Zoom. And many of them once I pop on, I don't find this usually until I get on, is they say, hey, would you mind if I also just recorded the video? I can use snippets, or I can post this on my YouTube channel. And so because of that, you might want to consider, and I don't have them on right now because I don't need to, you might want to consider these in the ear, and I'm holding them up for those watching the video, but these are clear in the ear headphones that cost maybe $20 on Amazon, that are great because I can put these in my ear. If you've ever watched TV, you've seen people fiddling with their ear. It's something very similar where you are able to get their sound from your computer into your ear. Now, why is that important? Well, a big mistake that a lot of new podcast interviewees do wrong is that they forget to wear headphones. The reason why that's important is because what happens is feedback. You say, what's feedback? Well, if I don't have headphones on and I'm using, let's say, the speakers on my computer and I've got it turned up loud, that person's voice is actually going into my microphone and coming back to them like an echo. And that will drive people crazy. All right. Not only that, but it messes up the recording. So you're going to want to have headphones. Okay. That's equipment piece number one. Equipment piece number two is get a dynamic microphone. Now there's two types. There's condenser and there's a dynamic. A condenser picks up sound no matter where it's coming from in the room. A dynamic microphone is only going to pick up the voice that is going directly in it. In fact, you'll notice right now that when I turn my head, my voice will begin to fade out. Are you ready? So this is me turning my head away from the microphone. You probably lost a little bit of my voice right then, right? The good news is the kids could be screaming in the next room. The dog could be barking, and it's not going to mess up the interview. So consider a dynamic microphone. One of my favorites, it's not the one that I have, but one of my favorites to get started is a microphone called the Pod Mic, and it is by Rode. So it's a Rode Pod Mic. I have the next level up, the Rode Procaster is what I use. So that's big tip number one, is for around $100, get you a good dynamic microphone and also get you some $20 in-the-ear headphones, and you're in business for around $120. All right, pro tip number two, listen to a few episodes. So if you've been invited on a show, it only takes, you don't have to sit there and just like binge listen to every episode, but it is good for you to get a little bit of an idea of what you're headed into, because every podcast is so different. Some podcasts, you have the host is like a fast talker. They're like a fast talker. They want fast, quick answers. You got other podcasts that are easy. We're just chilling out. We're having a conversation. You need to get a feel of what you're walking into, and that's going to help you to kind of match the environment. Just like when you're interviewing for a regular day job, right? You want to match the energy of the person that's interviewing you. That same concept comes to podcasting. So take a little bit of a listen to the podcast that you're about to go on so you can get a sense of what it's like before you jump into it. All right, here's pro tip number three. Know the target audience. Now, sometimes you can find this out by just looking around the podcast, or, maybe it's been named for a certain audience, but you want to know who the audience that you're actually talking to. And the reason why is you're going to want to tailor it towards them. So if I'm jumping on a podcast and I know it's primarily like more brick and mortar businesses that are wanting to grow their list or do more stuff online, then I've got to have a different mindset than if I'm on a podcast that's for authors, people who are wanting to write books. So it's important that you know the audience. If you're still not sure, when you first get on the podcast interview, you usually are jumping into that Zoom room before that person hits record. You can simply say, hey, just give me a quick recap or better understanding of who your audience is. I want to just try to tailor my answers to them. Okay? So that's pro tip number three. Here's pro tip number four. Show up filled up. What that means is you don't want to put your interview back to back to other appointments. So you don't want to jump off of at the last minute, jump off of a 1 hour call with your CPA and jump right into this podcast interview and think, okay, now what is this interview about? Okay, how am I doing this? Okay, and it's like you got to have that a few minutes of just kind of taking a deep breath and getting ready to like give your best. Okay. Just because you're showing up on a microphone and you're not showing up on stage doesn't mean that that you should treat it any differently, right? It should be treated the same way. You need to prepare yourself, get ready to step in and give your best. All right. Then that leads me to pro tip number 5. Again, this is all about how to show up best and be a great podcast guest, is make the host look good. You see, it's really not about you. It's about a discussion. It's about a message. It's about a conversation with the host. The host has brought you on to further the message of their podcast. So how can you contribute to that message that they're already having with the audience they're building, right? So don't make the interview about you. Yes, they're asking you questions, and yes, you're contributing to the conversations, but I want you to think about how can you make them look good? What are some ways that you can showcase them or brag about them or talk about, this amazing thing that they've done on their website or what they're doing, right? Let's make the host look good. Pro tip number 6. This is a big one. Keep your answers under 2 minutes. Now, I first learned this strategy when I started doing some more investigation of tips for being like on a live broadcast. When this latest book came out, I've had an opportunity now to be on a couple of like live radio shows. One was over in England, one was up in Detroit, and I knew that this was going to be different than like a podcast interview. So I did a little bit of research, on like how to handle live TV if you ever get on live TV or you're brought in as a guest with your local TV station. And one of the things they talk about is being very succinct and not rambling on and on and on. And this is so important because you don't want to lull your host to sleep. You don't want them thinking, if this person would just shut up, I can say something that I want to say, or I can ask them a follow-up question about something they said. But not only they talked about A, but then they transitioned to talk about B and then C and then D. No, this is a conversation. People enjoy listening to interview podcasts because they're a rich conversation. Now, right now, this podcast is a one-way dialogue. But when you're asked a question, it's okay to give a little bit of your backstory. People want to hear that, but don't let it be 10 minutes. Let it be a minute. Let it be 2 at the most. Now, I don't sit here and time myself when I'm being interviewed to make sure that I'm staying under the 2-minute rule, but it's in my head to be like, I need to answer the question, but I need to not go longer than I need to, because at the end of the day, this is about a back and forth conversation, right? All right. Pro tip number 7. This is after your interview. This is something almost everybody doesn't do, and this is one that I forget to do at times, but I'm trying to get better at it. The best thing in the world you can do after your interview, take 30 seconds and go leave a review on that podcast. If you have ever run a podcast, or if you're running a podcast, you know how dear and precious podcast reviews are, especially on iTunes, right? I mean, they help to get the show out there. They help people notice how many ratings and what those ratings are. And it literally takes 30 seconds to just go to that podcast on iTunes, hit the 5-star review and give a positive comment about something you love about that show, right? It endears yourself to that host as well, because they feel like that that you enjoyed being on their show and that it was important to you. Okay? All right. And then finally, a pro tip for podcasting, pro tip number 8, is to promote the interview once live. Now, if you're able to send an email out, do it if you have a list. If you're not, if you've got something else going on that day, depending on when the podcast is coming out, you can at least shout it from the rooftops on social media. Take a couple minutes and just go post on your Instagram or your Facebook. What this does too is it builds social proof for you. So think about it. It's a win-win, because not only are you letting your audience know about this podcast, because they may end up wanting to subscribe to this podcast, but it also lets people know, wow, Jonathan seems like an expert, because every week I'm seeing that he's on another show. And it builds the credibility and the authority of your platform while also helping the podcast guest. All right, so there you go. Which of the 8 do you like? Let me know. So these are some great tips. I hope you'll remember them. If I went through them too quickly, re-listen or re-watch this episode, write these 8 pro tips down. Maybe you need to have them on a 3x5 card, because they're practical and you can use them to show up filled up for the podcast you're going to be on. Also, don't forget that if you want to know how to turn your passion into a platform, we've got it all laid out for you in this book. I give you a 4-part framework to go from discovering your message to marketing your message to full-time income. Go to yourmessagemattersbook.com to get a free copy today. So again, I'll send you a physical free book copy. All we ask is that you pay shipping and handling. Go to yourmessagemattersbook.com. All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. And what would you like for me to cover on future episodes? Let me know. And also, if you like the show, would you take a moment and rate, review, share our show? It would mean the world to us. And until next time, never forget, your message matters.